Hello, and welcome to the hashtag Here to Hear Keeping It 100 podcast. My name is Damon Naylor, and I'll be serving as the host. I'm the NAFCM media guru, and I'm joined by my co-host, DG Mon, the president of NAFCM. What's going on, DG?
Hey, how are you doing, my friend? Doing great here. Excited to have another opportunity to learn together and see what we end up listening and hearing.
Yes, awesome. Likewise. Well, today we have a magnificent guest with us out of St. Paul, Minnesota, which is Ken Fox. Ken is a professor of critical thinking and conflict management and founding director of conflict studies at Hameline University and the author of Perspectives of Conflict. And without further ado, we're going to bring in Ken so we can have this dynamic conversation tonight. Well, welcome, Ken. We have just formally introduced you to the audience, and at this time, we want to give you a chance to share any background information on your personal life or just who you are.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I feel quite honored. So just as a quick thumbnail, I am currently, as I think you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a professor of critical thinking and conflict management at Hameline University in Minnesota. But I followed a bit of a journey to get here. I received my original mediation training in the late 1980s in Portland, Oregon, where I was living and practicing law at the time. But my initial training was through a well-respected community mediation organization. And if I can do a shout out, at the time it was called Confluence Northwest. And I was influenced greatly by the three principles of that organization. So I mediated while I was practicing law. And then as I progressed, I realized that my interest was really more in working on the more holistic side of conflict than specifically in terms of litigation or the legal issues, which are also very important, but my interest was broader. Got more involved in the mediation community in Oregon and then nationally. And I had an opportunity to come here to Minnesota to be the founding director of conflict studies at my university. So over these last 30 years, I've immersed myself in the world of working with folks who are trying to work through human conflict. And one of the courses that I have taught over these many years is a course on perspectives on conflict or theories of conflict. And that's really what sort of led ultimately to me being interested in the book that we've identified perhaps for part of the conversation today.
Okay, awesome. So look, you pretty much jumped into it and given us that background of what inspired you basically to write that book. And I assume it's through your experience all of these years, you being a true veteran in this field. So we thank you for being with us tonight. And we're going to just jump right into it. One of the main things we got from that wonderful book of yours is the three metaphors of conflict. Can you analyze and break that down for us in the audience so we can understand each one and how it's relevant?
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to do it. And if I can just say just one more, a little broader piece that puts context to these metaphors. The purpose for writing the book is really a conversation between me as the author and whoever happens to be reading it. And I'm envisioning that these are practitioners, these are students who are studying conflict. And conflict is an immensely vast field. So how do we get our hands around it in a way that's practical, but that has elements of being holistic? So the book is divided into three parts. And in the first part, I try to lay out some broad imagery to kind of get us into an orientation toward conflict. So your question about the three metaphors is where I introduce them. So there are lots of metaphors for conflict, and I don't pretend to have the best, but the three that I landed on that I describe in the first part of the book, the first metaphor is conflict as a mosaic. And the purpose of describing conflict as a mosaic is to recognize the complexity of conflict, that it has many, many elements, many, many dimensions, even when we're just working with individuals. And if you think about a mosaic, it is made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual tiles. Usually we stand back and we look at the image overall and we see flowers or an image of a person or a landscape. But if you look much more closely, you realize how each individual tile contributes to the larger picture. So the metaphor of a mosaic is a reminder that it's valuable to step back and look holistically, but it's also very important to come in very close and try to understand the many different individual elements that can make up a conflict experience. The second metaphor addresses one of the problems of the first metaphor. A mosaic is beautiful, but it's static. It's stone and concrete, and it doesn't move unless you drop and break it. Well, conflict is not static. Conflict is very dynamic. And so the metaphor of a mosaic somewhat limits our work when we're dealing with real people and real situations. So the second metaphor tries to complement the mosaic. And that second metaphor is of a rushing river. So I lived in Oregon. That's where I got my training. I think of mountain rivers. And if you or anyone has stood by a rushing mountain stream, there's an energy to it that's influenced by the source of the stream, how much water flows, by the contours of the stream. And if we want to get from one side of the river to another, at some point we need to wade in. So the metaphor of the rushing river is a reminder that we are not passive observers standing on the side of a conflict, the way you would look at a mosaic. We're metaphorically in the boat with the parties. And our role is to help them navigate what could feel like a turbulent river, or could at times feel rather calm. So those are the first two metaphors. But then as I think about those two metaphors, there's yet another piece that's missing. And that is that conflict does not exist in a vacuum. Every conflict is within a larger context. And that larger context, whether it's what came before, what I call antecedent, or what's happening surrounding the conflict as it's happening, those shape and have an impact on the conflict. And they also are a rich source of insight into the conflict. So the first metaphor is of an ecosystem, where I actually, in the book, I start with the river and I talk about a salmon in the river and how the salmon can't live without the food that flows in the river and the water that rushes past it. So to understand that conflict is really part of larger systems and structures. So my hope from those three metaphors is that when we think of them together, it helps us think of a complementary way at a broad level to envision conflict and the importance of looking at conflict from different vantage points.
Wonderful, excellently articulated. I love it. Conflict as the mosaic, the rushing river, and then the ecosystem. All right. DG, did you have anything you want to ask Ken or chime in on with those metaphors or whatever?
I think it's exciting just to use all three of them to get a better view of the conflict that may be ensnaring those that are in it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you enter into that picture without becoming a part of the picture?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. In chapter 3 of the book, I talk about ways to cultivate competence as a conflict practitioner. And among the things that I describe are reflective practice, which is reflection on action, reflecting back on what I've done in the past and what has been helpful. Reflection in action, which is being in the flow with the parties. But your question, I think, touches on the next part of that, and that is, we are not just reflecting, we are engaged in what's called reflexive practice. We are not separate from the parties. As I describe in the book, we're not sitting behind a one-way mirror in a police station watching someone talk. We're right in the room with them, and our interactions have influence. If we had no influence, why are we there? So the question then is, what's the nature of influence that's helpful to parties? Not how do we not have influence, but what influence is constructive, is helpful, and what influence can kind of interfere. So I'll circle around to your question. I use another metaphor. I'm full of metaphors right now. I try to think about, in what way can I help shine a light on something helpful for the parties without casting a shadow on their process? So I think that gets to your question of, we're in the room with them. In many ways, that is the self-work that we do as conflict practitioners. It's almost paradoxical. We want to help others, but in some ways, the most important thing we can do to be helpful to others is to know ourselves, understand ourselves, and have a present awareness so we know when to get out of the way. And when we are sort of joining in a constructive way with the parties so that we can help support their own work and understanding. That may be too, I don't know if that's more of an abstract reflection than what you're looking for, but that's sort of a first answer.
For those listening, what would you suggest as a first step?
Consistent with this sort of abstract theme of reflection and working on ourselves, a lot of different, well, we all do it our own ways. I'll talk about what I do. So I try to follow mindfulness practice, but I know that when I'm engaging in it, sometimes I feel like I'm performing it rather than being in it. So I try to know myself and what works for me. So, for example, when I'm getting ready for a mediation or facilitating with a group or working with communities, I know that I need an hour or an hour and a half beforehand to just let go of everything else around me and settle in. And often I'll actually just go and sit in my car. Even if I'm not driving someplace, I sit in my car. Some people listen to music. I just listen to the silence and I try to reflect. So that's sort of an immediate preparation. But on a longer term way that I try to be aware is not just mindfulness, but what I would describe as critical self-reflection. And that by that I don't mean criticizing myself, but what I mean is intentionally examining my motivations, why I'd make the choices that I make. And that actually relates to the second whole section of the book on 6 different ways to kind of critically examine conflict so that I can clarify, well, what are my unstated assumptions? What do I act on that I'm not aware of that impacts the parties when I'm meeting with them? Those kinds of things. I'm not sure if that's even concrete enough yet, but maybe that's in the right direction.
I think it gets there, and it's a good lead in, I believe, to another question Damon has on his heart.
Yes. So we won't, you won't be able to just dive deeply into them, but looking at the 6 hallmarks of artistry and practice, and like I say, kind of touching on those and how they're relevant to, conflict and how we can apply these strategies and practice them as well.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. So what these hallmarks refer to is, there are a number of people who do a lot of really good reflective work, In the book, I actually refer to Michael Lang and Allison Taylor, and they identify 6 hallmarks: attention to detail, curiosity, exploration and discovery, developing and testing or formulating ideas, interpreting with resilience, and maintaining patience. These are the hallmarks they identify. These can be techniques to help me sort of lose myself into the flow of what is happening with the parties. The example that I use, or I use a couple examples in the book, is being in the flow is a process. You first need to develop mastery. You develop skills. Then you reflect on those skills and you develop mastery. And at a certain point, you can lose yourself into what's around you. And I use the example of a musician who's in an orchestra. At first, they're the only ones who are sounding good, right? Well, then at some point, they feel comfortable with their instrument, and then they start listening to the other musicians. And you can tell when an orchestra is one whole harmonious piece. That's what that being in the flow is. And so the 6 hallmarks help a practitioner sort of move along that path toward that place of being mastery and connected.
In applying those things, you are sitting in St. Paul, and certainly those listening to this are aware of the challenges to the fabric of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be some of those mosaics were crashed to the ground. Some of those Russian rivers did flood over. How would you advise individuals applying what you just reviewed with us in those types of rather disconcerting situations? Or how did you try to apply it while that was going on
It,
and still
it's
going on?
and still going on in it, and I'm sure it's going on in its own ways for other people and other communities. Absolutely. It's challenging. One thing I try to remember is that I can't do everything all at once. I need to remember what's the context that I'm in and what's the scope of what I can be helpful about, and not feel as though I am doing something incomplete if the context doesn't allow it. So, for example, one of the chapters in the book addresses social systems and structures. When I was experiencing, and when I experience what's been happening in the larger community here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, I'm aware that there are factors, there are power elements, there are structural elements that are well beyond what I can touch. It's helpful if I appreciate and understand those larger structures. Even if I can't change them this afternoon, I can incorporate those insights into how I can best navigate what is within the context I'm working. So to be concrete, if I'm working with some parties who are feeling a struggle because of ideological differences, and those differences are constantly amplified in social media or in larger contexts, I can't change social media. But if I am aware that those are factors, we can make that part of our own interaction, our own conversation, so they can be more informed and able to make decisions for themselves, how to navigate those larger systems. So that's sort of what I try to remind myself is be modest. We can have positive influence in so many ways, but we can't move mountains in an afternoon. And we just want to be in tune with what is really around us.
Well, thank you so much. And for those who are listening and haven't yet read the book, please look up Perspectives on Conflict: Insights for Professional and Personal Practice by Ken Fox and learn more.
Great.
Well, as you did a wonderful job, Ken, and you dropped so many jewels and given us so much insightful information. We thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And most importantly, thanks for keeping it 100, as we say. And we just appreciate you being our guest. And like I say, we always say the time just goes by so fast, but you have accomplished and said so much in the short time. But we appreciate everything that you shared. And just to take us out, is there one last nugget of wisdom that you could leave with our audience?
Yeah, boy, that's an easy one in 30 seconds or less. The one thing I keep coming back to, and when I know both of you teach as well when we're working with folks, the core of constructive conflict work, in my view, is remembering our humanity. And each one of us brings qualities of humanity that can help unlock blocks with other people. We can learn, we can study, but don't lose who we are, because we each bring our own unique presence that can be helpful to others.